feature presentation.
Let's just start anyway. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another Untitled Movie Review.
Of course.
I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck. Alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is Tomato Meter approved, Eric Marchant.
I have 3 dogs. You know, I have 3 dogs. That's all I can say. You know,
them.
I can't.
You can't
no.
control them. And they're big ass.
I'm not going to
dogs,
apologize to you. Well, I've got 2
Mhm.
big ones and a medium one. Hudson's
Okay.
a medium-sized dog.
All
so,
right.
yeah.
I just remember the 2 big ones because I'm not a dog guy. I liked dogs, but like big dogs scare me because when I was a kid, like I got chased by like a German Shepherd, a really mean German Shepherd, and a couple of Rottweilers when I was a paper boy. Very cliche,
Yep.
but scared the shit out of me. And then my sister got like nipped by a dog once too, and I've just been kind of afraid of big dogs since then. So even though I know they're like friendly, but like whenever one like jumps at me, it kind of fucks me up for some reason. But today we're not here to talk about dogs. We're here to talk
Or
about
dog
spiders. Yeah. So today we are reviewing a little bit late because, you know, mental health stuff, guys. I'm slowly getting back into it. I'll talk about all of that on a main show that we're actually going to record today. So you'll be able to listen to that and watch on the Untitled Movie Podcast channel. But yes, today we are talking about Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which is now playing in cinemas everywhere, which you've probably seen by now, doing very, very well. So this being a week after it's released, we're going to go full spoilers on this review. So like, there's not going to be a spoiler-free section. Eric and I both loved it. This was probably my most anticipated film of the year, lived up to that hype and even more. Do have a few criticisms, but I think it's not a perfect movie. Mainly if you know our opinion on Dune, you'll know where I'm going with on this. But we are going to talk about Spider-Verse, Across the Spider-Verse, with full spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, please go do it. I don't know what you're waiting for. Maybe you haven't seen the first film, but it is streaming on a bunch of different places. But you should watch that first film and then go see this immediately. It's very, very good. But Eric, how are you doing?
I'm good. And speaking of mental health, there's going to be a short Miles Morales film, The Spider Within, that deals with him focusing on a panic attack. So
I didn't know that.
yeah,
Okay.
it just was announced today, I believe. So there's that to look forward to as well. And you
That's
know,
cool.
very, you know, the writers on this and the production team are very keen on kind of making a real world Spider-Man within an animated milieu. So, you know, it's always nice to think about, you know, that there's a kind of a real world aspect that you can relate to. You know, it's not just simply enjoying the spectacle of, you know, this comic book character that we've come to know and love, and just the canon of the Spider-Verse in general, you know, being a great escapist entertainment. There's a lot there to really enjoy from a practical sense and a realistic sense that grounds the nature of the storytelling. And I think that's also why this movie and the first Spider-Verse, you know, Across the Spider-Verse and Into the Spider-Verse, are two, if not the best comic book movies ever made, because they play with the medium of animation, but they are also great genre defying films that know how to balance both action and character development. We talked about this a little while ago on a regular show, where a lot of the motivations and the story comes from how characters make decisions and the choices they make in terms of whether they be consequences or motivations to move to the next part of the development. It's the motivating factors in which the story progresses. And that is something that is very unique within a comic book movie, because most comic book adaptations, it's all about a MacGuffin getting you one place to the next, or, you know, convoluting the story with multiple characters and origins and tangling things up unnecessarily, where this feels
does that in a very streamlined
you understand everything that's going
way.
on. It's completely coherent.
Yeah. I'll just kick it off. I mean, I think this movie is fantastic. And that's me someone who is not a fan of half movies or part one movies. I think that's my biggest criticism of the film, is that it builds and builds and builds and builds and then kind of fucking gives you blue balls at the end, by not reaching its climax. And I don't know. Like I'm so mixed on that. I've seen the film twice now. It's really a pet peeve of mine. Like I know television does this, and cinema is becoming more like television. Television's becoming more like cinema, where you get episodic storytelling. We have had part one movies for, all the time. Like, I mean, and we're getting more and more of them. It's just my preference is for a film to have a beginning and an end. And this was one of our biggest criticisms when we watched Dune, was that it felt like literally the first act of a movie. This doesn't quite just feel like the first act of a movie. It does almost have a complete arc. And I've talked to some people, and they gave me the perspective of like, watch the film from Gwen's perspective, and it does kind of begin and end with her. So it does kind of have a full arc of her story, kind of entrenched in the middle of this bigger Miles Morales story, where she's obviously an integral part of it, and I like that. And on second rewatch, I did see that a bit more, but I do feel like, and I don't want to start with the negatives, because I'm just saying my one little pet peeve, because then we're gonna gush about the movie for the rest of the time. But that's my only criticism of the movie, and I think that's what's stopping this movie from being better than the first movie for me, just because I feel like it is still incomplete. Like, it does have a full arc for Miles, and it does have a full arc for Gwen. And they'll expand on those themes and the different things in the next movie, and even build new ones. But like, I think just where it left me wanting more, which is a good thing, but then it also left me feeling incomplete, or it got me, I was like, oh, I want to see this, and then it just kind of, ends. And some people will love that, some people won't. I'm kind of more in the won't category. But I think overall, I think this is one of the most gorgeous movies I've ever seen in my life. One of the best animated movies I've ever seen, like pure from a technical standpoint of just, the first movie was just, completely, I think, changed, you know, animation and animated movies moving forward. We've seen its inspiration in from other studios like Pixar with Turning Red, even though that's more on the anime side. We've talked about, Eric, when we saw that. Puss in Boots, the newest one, takes this. I mean, Mitchell's versus the Machines. It's a lot of the same team that worked on, Spider-Verse and things like that have gone on to different projects, but you can see that inspiration that has come from that first movie. And this just takes that up to like, 100 with the different animation styles. And because you're jumping to different universes in this one, and including almost 200 different spider people, like the different animation styles and how they all work together is just mind blowing. And how that works with, the fantastic score of the movie by Daniel Pemberton, and like, it just, the performances throughout the movie. Like, I think, Shameik Moore and Hailee Steinfeld, really kind of have a hold of these characters now. Brian Tyree Henry, and Jake Johnson, Jason Schwartzman, his arc as the Spot, I think, is fantastic, going from this joke to this incredibly menacing, nemesis at the end of the film. Like, the new inclusions from Issa Rae and Karan Soni, and Oscar Isaac, who was in the first film a little bit, and Daniel Kaluuya as Spider-Punk. Like, there's so much in this movie, to your point, Eric, like, where some superhero movies, when you say they have 200 characters and multiple villains and multiple heroes, and like, it's so hard to balance all that. But like, it's literally, it feels like magic when you're watching this movie, of how the animation and the performances and the character arcs and character growth throughout these two movies, and just this movie. I don't know how they did it in both of them, and how they lived up to the expectations of that first movie, and even maybe surpassed them in some areas. And while I said I still ultimately like that first film more, I think just because it was new, and I like origin stories, and it felt complete, right? Like, that moment with Miles when he first becomes, Spider-Man, and that leap of faith, that moment is, I think, one of the most iconic scenes in superhero history. And the way the music works in that, and that shot of him falling upwards when he's diving down, like, There's nothing in this movie quite like that moment, but I think once I get the second half of this movie, if I look at those two parts as a whole, I think it has the potential to surpass that first movie. It's just right now, as I'm seeing this part one, which I know they changed it to two different titles to try to make people realize it's not a part one. But I think it's incredible. We'll talk way more about it, but those are just kind of my high level thoughts. I think it's fantastic. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, this movie is spectacular in every frame, and when you're watching this movie, you can't help but be sucked into the different animation styles and how it's continually changing it up. It's just a complete and utter feast for the eyes, and when you're just completely engulfed by the material, you realize how incredibly thought out the script is when you're watching this, because there is the multiverse aspect of it all, but what it's doing in terms of playing within different animation styles but also different worlds and bringing them together, or kind of creating an intersection of these worlds, you realize how the live action Marvel movies or DC films in the last few years that have also taken inspiration from the 2018 film haven't taken the right inspiration. They're basically taking these properties and selling them to you and saying, hey, look at this, let me tease you this with this one or two
Multiverse, yeah.
with these cameos, or let's throw this up for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. But it never got the essence of why those movies work. You need to kind of play within the fabric of these movies and not simply just tease it by showing a scene of it, or a couple of seconds of like, oh, this could be a world you explore. It's like, no, actually spend the time to have these characters explore these landscapes and see what they do and see how they interact with other people.
It's about the characters, not just showing a different universe. And it's I think what you said is taking from that first movie. It wasn't that it was, here's all the different Spider-Men and here's all the different universes. It was Miles' story at the core of it, of being, human and real and personal. And I feel like, I agree with you that some of these other movies, and I haven't seen The Flash yet, but I, with Marvel and the MCU doing their multiverse thing, because that I think, which was really introduced to the mainstream in Spider-Verse, it's like, no, here's Black Bolt and a different version of Reed Richards and stuff like that, where
Yeah.
it's like, okay, but we don't know anything about these versions of them. You use them almost as just plot, right? And then
or fan
a
service,
a surprise, things like that. So I agree with you there, but keep going.
Yeah, and you also just have the core of the family. I think the Miles Morales family dynamic is really important, because you can see the pressures of someone who really wants to venture outside of Brooklyn and know the world and embrace it and become a part of it. But then you have the matriarch who is still protective of her teenage son and knows the world a little bit better than him through experience, and doesn't want to see him get hurt or rejected in maybe the way that she was, or she knows how society can be. And with that, I think is really interesting, where your world starts off so small, because when you're a child, you see the world as big and threatening, but the older you get, you become more curious about it, so you want to kind of take that step into a bigger sort of zone. And this is for both Miles and his counterpart of Spider-Man, stepping into worlds, not just one world, not just
wanting
Earth,
to tell
but
your own story too, right?
yeah. And I think one of the great aspects of this narrative is seeing how Miguel O'Hara, voiced by Oscar Isaac, creates this elitist kind of club where everybody except Miles, for the most part, is invited to be a part of this group. And so it's dealing with elitism and dictatorship and sort of repressing those who are marginalized without giving them a place to be, who are also doing very much what Miguel is doing in terms of protecting the people he cares about, but he's doing it in a way that feels like, okay, well, Miles isn't he's not one of us, he's not a part of the team. And I think that mentality comes through in life in general when it comes to, people feeling like they're not good enough to be a part of a membership or a club, and just because their writing doesn't meet, this criteria, doesn't mean
Or
that
they're just
they're
different in general, or they weren't
exactly.
supposed to be here. And I sorry to interrupt you, but I
Yeah.
totally agree. And I think that meta layer on the movie even mimics how Miles was perceived when he was first introduced in the comics too, which is, I know, something people have been talking about, and it's obvious in the movie, but like, of just him being, a black Spider-Man. And we've just had Peter Parker,
Well, Afro
throughout the
Latin,
history.
I
Yeah,
think that's,
sorry.
yeah.
Thank you. But just, I mean, in the comics being introduced that way, of that's what I meant, people perceiving him as and going, not my Spider-Man, or it's Peter Parker, like, we don't need this kid. And then that being, shown in this movie with that kind of meta layer, I think is really interesting. But then on top of that, like you just mentioned, and all these other different kind of ways of life, of how people either aren't welcomed or told that you're not supposed to be here, or you're not good enough. And I think it does such a good job, like, with the juxtaposition between that, and then, yeah, like with his family, and then as the Miles Morales part of it, and the juxtaposition between Spider-Man and Miles Morales as well. So
Yeah, and then you mentioned the spot. What I really like about that character is at first when you're introduced to him, and I think even, casting Jason Schwartzman as the voice, there's a non-threatening quality to him and a playfulness to him, but it's almost like any kind of, even his name, the Spot, you could almost look at it as something that you consider like a disease that maybe seems non-threatening, or like a rash or an infection that, it's like, oh, I'll just, put some polysporin on, and at the end of the day, and maybe you don't get to it right away, and then a week later you realize it's gotten worse, and then you need to go to the doctors for it. Or,
yeah,
you can look at it as something more metaphorical to how, someone like Trump was considered a joke at first, and everybody thought to themselves like, oh, this is not going to turn into
didn't take
anything
him
more than
seriously, right?
a gimmick. And then it became something far more serious
More
and
power he gained,
concerning,
and yeah,
and then
yeah.
it corrupted and infected the American society as a whole. And then it also made us all look at sort of like, this group of people that felt that they needed to rise up and become this, villainous sort of section. So there's a lot going on there with, its metaphors and its structuring in how it's telling this story that both relates to the Spider-Verse, but also, our own world. And then on top of all that, as you mentioned, I think the only criticism I have is the same one that you do, where I think you do, like, if going into this movie that it is part one of two, you're waiting for that cliffhanger to kind of undercut the climax. And so when you're watching it, when you see Miles enter his own home, his
Yeah.
world, and then, his mom is acting a little bit different, and not sure who this Spider-Man is he's referencing, and things like that, you begin to realize, okay, this is where they're going to leave things. And I think that does take you out of the movie a little bit. Now, if you're someone that doesn't know that this is, a part one of two going in, I think you're also going to be disappointed, not in an anticipation kind of way, or be self-aware of it. But once you get to that ending, I think you might be a little bit dissatisfied with just how things are left, you know, and given like how long we might have to wait for it, because even though tentatively it's supposed to come out next year, that's probably wishful thinking.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it just I've seen both reactions, right? I think some people really love a cliffhanger and they go, "Holy fuck, like I can't wait." And they love that ending, and I could see people being a little bit disappointed because it doesn't really give you an ending, right? Like, it does feel like it's breaking for an intermission, right? Like, it does feel like something like this would be a 4 hour long movie, and you take a 20-minute intermission and you come back and you watch the rest. Like, that's how I would have preferred to watch it. But I mean, I'm fine with waiting as well. It's just I don't know. It's the one like purist thing that um I don't get hung up on things with movies, and I kind of let them be what they are. But for some reason, it's like TV, I don't mind. Give me a cliffhanger. I'll come back in a week, or even at the end of a season, you come back in a year and you know you're getting it in a year. And I think that's the approach we're getting in some movies now. And I just like those to be different. Like I like we said this a lot in our Dune review of just like the best, part ones of a trilogy, like still have a full arc in that first movie. And I think you can argue it here, and we'll talk about Gwen's kind of story throughout this movie, even though it's very much a Miles Morales movie. But even the first film and the second film don't start with Miles. The first film starts with Chris Pine's Spider-Man. The second movie starts with Gwen Stacy's Spider-Woman. So like I do think that third movie will finally start with Miles, because he's, it's taking a while for people to take him seriously. And I think that's kind of even intentional. But, even starting with Gwen for the first 20 minutes of this movie before you see Miles, and then is it an interesting approach, and something that I wasn't totally on board at first, because you're there because it's, it is a Miles Morales movie, or that's what it's pitched as, right? Even though really it's just a spider person
Or
movie, right?
beings in this
Beings,
case.
yeah, like yes, exactly. Very much Miles's story still, but so those are just like the little things. And then there was something else that I wanted to bring up that I wasn't. The sound mix, obviously, which we've heard that they fixed. So we're only talking about the versions we've seen, which in that first week I saw twice. Eric saw once. I saw it in IMAX once and AVX once. AVX screening was not great. I went to a brand new theater and I was shocked. I thought it was the theater's fault at first, but then as I came, I started talking about it online. People are like, "Oh no, my sound was awful too." So I don't know how that happens, and I feel like that's fair to criticize the movie for that. Sound mixing is a huge part of a movie. You can win an Oscar for it. So I mean, it was not good. I will say that. Like it was really bad during the Gwen Stacy parts at the beginning, and then it got better. And Eric, you jump in when you want, but I think your screening was very similar. But still, with some of the action mixed with the dialogue, it was very hard to hear the spider people at certain, or spider
It
beings at
sounded like a
certain
Christopher
moments.
Nolan movie at times, like
Yeah,
Tenet or The Dark Knight, where like his movies tend to have, this was an error, but his movies tend to have horrible sound mixes where you can't hear
intentionally.
some of the dialogue when the score, especially when it's a Hans Zimmer score, is kind of overpowering, and with that first act in particular, even though there is so much going on visually speaking that it keeps you completely engaged with the material, you do have a harder time hearing some of the more kind of um, vulnerable and sort of character based moments in that opening 20 minutes or so, or even into the half an hour. But like the Renaissance Vulture Guggenheim fight
Yeah,
sequence is incredible, but then you have like the impact of Captain Stacy and Gwyn kind of having that conversation of Shea Whigham voicing Captain Stacy and Hailee Steinfeld, and it's such a really powerful moment of character development and what you look for in a comic book movie. But there is something that sounded kind of muffled about it, where
yeah.
it didn't sound like it was the proper sound mix. But when watching it, I was thinking, oh, it was something wrong with the theater itself. Like there was something wrong with,
That's our go-to usually in
yeah,
that
with
case.
with the
Hey,
actual
which I think
system.
is fair for us. I think it's
Well,
fair.
because 9 times out of 10 it is the problem with especially Cineplex and its monopoly over Canadian theater chains, and there not being any uh other options. I think that
Yeah.
that's an important conversation to have. But yeah, going back to just thinking about like the criticisms and just like the idea of the part one, it's also just fascinating and kind of funny to think that two of the movies we reviewed in the last couple of weeks or the last month are both Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse and Fast X, both of which have Doom alumni, and both Doom alumni were killed in Dune, but now we're moving on to respected franchise Jason Momoa in Fast X, now
And
going
Oscar
on
Isaac. Yeah.
to potentially two more
Yeah.
Fast movies, and then Oscar Isaac in Across the Spider-Verse and probably Beyond the Spider-Verse as well. So it's just funny thinking about that as well, where you have these guys that are kind of a part of this trend, but it's always been around. I mean, Back to the Future is the most
Oh,
obvious one,
totally.
where I
Yeah.
remember as a kid, all three of them were available at the time that I saw them. But I remember Back to the Future 2 specifically having that ending where it showed you the Western sequence. It's like
I
coming
know, but doesn't that
soon.
feel like a complete movie though? And that's just a stinger to the next
It
one
does. It
like
does.
that?
Well, the first one in particular, when like it was never meant to. There was never meant to be like a Back to the Future 2, like the way that
Yeah.
that movie ended was like, Marty, there's something wrong with your kids. You gotta fix them, and then they go back. Then they go to the future. Like it was just kind of like a fun button to end a movie. But then with Back to the Future 2, they had shot Back to the Future 3 by that point, so they were showing you like literally
Yeah.
this is coming soon, and it's the same way with Beyond the Spider-Verse, where you don't see any footage from that movie, but they are telling you that yes, there is another
Oh, yeah, they
part of this
blatantly do
story
that.
to
That's the
come.
post-credits scene.
Yeah,
It's not a scene. It's just Miles Morales will return in Beyond the
where
Spider-Verse.
we were having this conversation, and I think it's an interesting one to have, where originally it was going to be a part 1 of 2, but then they got rid of the part 1, and you have Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning part 1 coming out, and then even with Dune, like it wasn't really announced until the movie played at Venice and started playing the festival circuit that people saw that it was Dune part 1. But even on the posters and being
They
nominated
avoided
for
that,
awards,
right?
it was
I
just
mean,
called Dune.
Infinity War was originally Infinity War Part 1 and Part 2, then got retitled to Endgame. So, like, we're seeing this a lot where a movie's almost announced as a Part 1, but whether it's someone at the studio or something that goes, "Listen, like, I have this theory. I don't know. I don't see the numbers, and you kind of see it in box office and in certain things. But I'm interested about Mission Impossible because they're sticking with the Part 1, where um I feel like it's something that almost deters people from seeing a movie and not excites them because they go, "Oh, part 1, that means it's not a full movie. Like I can just wait until part 2 comes out and I'll watch both of them or something." Or like I think it's different when a movie starts as just I mean Dune tried to do this even though the whole time it was really just part 1, but like John Wick, right? John Wick was just John Wick, and then once it was super popular, they went, "Okay, John Wick chapter 2, John Wick Chapter 3, Parabellum." Weird that they I love when studios just make weird title choices.
And then they drop it though
And then
afterwards, and
yeah,
then they
and then
never
it's so
have like a
strange.
second title after. It's weird.
But it's usually it takes shape after when the second movie comes out, and then people are like, "Okay, I know this is just part 2, and then maybe a part 3 will come out." But I think when they shoot back to back, and even Lord of the Rings, when Peter Jackson shot all 3 of those movies back to back to back, right? Like he shot them all as one film.
Yeah.
And then so even Fellowship, like I don't love the Lord of the Rings movies. I think um they're enjoyable. I watched them for the first time just like last year or something. But I those movies still and we said the same thing. They still feel like full movies, even though at the end it's like, let's go hunt some orcs or whatever. And they make the Fellowship doesn't get built until the end of the first movie. And it's like, okay, yeah, but you're still telling one bigger story. But I feel like you still need those arcs in each movie. And again, we'll talk about Gwen in a second. Like, and I still think that you need like a full arc. And I guess Gwen's arc with her father, with Captain Stacy, and her, going with the spider beings and then leaving them to help Miles at the end and gathering a team together to go help him. Like, I do find that is a complete arc, and I noticed that a lot more on my second watch. But I guess because I'm viewing this as a Miles Morales movie, it did feel incomplete to me. And which is Miles's story is not complete, and Gwen's story is not complete either. But in this movie, I feel like she has the most complete arc out of anyone, and I would say the Spot maybe doesn't have a complete arc because he's still trying to, you know, exact revenge. And it is a pretty simple revenge plot. But to your point of like, if you blame someone for turning you into what people view as this freak and you lose your job and people laugh at you and kind of, I think it is an interesting way of, someone who's ostracized from his community because of the way he looks. And then how that kind of makes a person kind of vengeful and want revenge. And I think that's kind of a good arc throughout the movie too. And the way that they use animation to kind of showcase his change, right, I think And they do that with all these characters. If you look at Gwen, her emotions throughout the movie, I think they do such a better job in this movie than the first one, where in the first movie she's animated very similarly to Miles when she's in his universe, where in this one I think they give her universe its own look and feel, and the way that they play with like watercolors, it almost looks like, and stuff like that, and like and pastels and things like that in her universe, and how her mood changes, like the world changes around her, and I think that's really awesome. So I kind of went off on a tangent. I don't know what the fuck we were talking about.
Well, I think we were talking about like the
part
idea
one
of the part one, but
yeah.
even something like, it's interesting with Dune because Dune, was being released during the pandemic, so there was that kind of caution from Warner Brothers that it's like, okay, well, we'll see how it does before we make a decision to greenlight
Right.
a sequel. But then calling it part one in the title of the actual movie indicates that there's confidence that yes, there will be another half to complete the film,
Well,
because
that seems like
clearly
a
it's
Denny
only
Villeneuve confidence and not necessarily a Warner Brothers
right,
confidence.
but then you look at something like Andy Muschietti's adaptation of It. That was just it, and there was the tease of chapter 2 at the end of it, but at the same time Warner Brothers was waiting to see how the film would do before officially greenlighting it. So there's not necessarily uh like the just because a movie says that there's going to be a sequel, or it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen sometimes
Have
either.
we had any part ones that never, or parts that never
I
got a
mean,
part two?
there are movies
I
where
mean, there's movies that have a cliffhanger or a teaser for another movie and then probably never
well, there are
follow up on
jokey
it.
ones.
But
Like I know a lot of people
yeah,
kind of reference like Buckaroo Banzai, for example, where like that has an ending where it's like uh make sure to tune in next time for the sequel to Buckaroo Banzai. And like everybody was like, oh, that sequel will probably come out in a couple of years. Or something like, even though it didn't have a sequel reference per se, but it was based on the first of a series of books, was something like Master and Commander with Russell Crowe, the Peter Weir movie, where a lot of people were expecting, because it was nominated for a bunch of Oscars, including Best Picture, everybody thought that that was going to become a series, and it never did. And even now people still are like, oh man, that would have been an amazing franchise, and it's one of Russell Crowe's best performances, and it's just kind of like a fun swashbuckling film as well, but like the effects are amazing, and it just came at a perfect time. So there are those movies that maybe that aren't necessarily like part one of something that haven't kind of fallen through, but there are movies where it's like, oh, there were maybe some expectation that you could continue it on based on you know existing source material, or the potential of the writers wanting to continue to develop the character. Or you get stuff that just doesn't really hit, like even something like the Gold Compass, right? Like the 2007 film, like even though they made it
right.
into a series
Yeah, that are part of a
afterwards,
series that just
it failed. Or even
yeah.
Divergent, like look at how that series kind of petered out, where that was a series of movies and then they didn't even finish the films because there wasn't it was at the end of the young adults kind of hysteria of things. So by the time that they got to the second last movie, people had lost interest in those films completely. So the last one was supposed to be a TV movie, and then that fell through. So there are those kind of situations, but I don't think there's been anything where it's like, part one of something being announced and then
And then
two or
part two not coming
three
out. Yeah.
doesn't ever happen. I think like you usually have the reinforcement of, yes, these are going to be released if you make the sign the deals, or make a contract for something like that. So those are issues where I think like it's just more of a money thing ultimately, where like there
Yeah.
are some studios that are like, okay, let's see how the first one does first before we make any sort of long-term commitments, because it's maybe untested, or it has been a while since people have been interested in this kind of property.
Yeah.
But with this, I mean, it kind of felt like a surefire thing. Once Into the Spider-Verse was released, it wins the Oscar. It's influenced blockbuster cinema, both live action and animated, in the last 5 years. And I think it will continue to. Another movie that looks very similar that's coming up is TMNT, Mutant
Yeah.
Mayhem. I'm sure the Transformers animated movie, Transformers 1, will probably take some influence from it. So, like that alone, I think is enough to generate that interest. And then, yeah, with Gwen's story, like, the way that her emotions externalize the color palette of the world that she's in, um, really give you a sense of who she is as a person. But then also, what I really love about this is that in that first movie, we do get her origin story, but just a snippet of it, and it's
Yeah.
done in a way that's kind of it's telling you in a way that you are familiar with. Like it's the classic story of losing somebody and then becoming, the hero of the story.
Yeah, almost like I always interpreted that as he was Spider-Man and died just like Gwen Stacy died, or
Yes.
not even he wasn't.
Or
Maybe he wasn't Spider-Man. Sorry, he was
Uncle
just
Ben.
died.
He's the
Yeah,
Uncle Ben,
well, of
and
course, but
yeah.
and then I viewed it as kind of how Gwen dies in Spider-Man's story. It was just a reverse of that, of like she couldn't save him from another villain. Like the lizard thing I didn't expect, and I don't know if we even knew that from that first movie. Like there's
No,
no
we
hints
didn't,
at that,
because
right?
that's the whole thing, because they play it in the first one like an Uncle Ben situation where Peter dies and she becomes Spider-Woman, and she takes on that mantle. And so with this, it's like like that was almost, even though it wasn't necessarily from the perspective of Miles, but it's like that's the version you assumed it to be, because you're being shown all these spider people stories, and almost in a comedic way. It's like, well, I started this way, and then I was bitten by a radioactive spider, and then my uncle died, and now I,
Mhm.
I have to save the day all the time in New York, or my universe. And with this, it's like, okay, well, you got the abbreviated version, but let's look at the nuances and complications of how Gwen really became Spider-Woman. And so with that, I think that adds so much more to her character. And like you were
Absolutely.
saying, it is her story from beginning to end, and that is where the satisfying sort of full web experience comes into play when you're
Mhm.
watching it from her perspective. Because even though Miles is the fulcrum of this entire series, within that you're still getting other people's perspectives and journeys. It almost weirdly reminds me of The Wire, where that first season of The Wire sets you up to think it's from the perspective of just the cops, but then it begins to branch out and explore, the city and the people living in Baltimore, and then also the politics of Baltimore. And
But it's
then
focused around this one thing that lets you
yes,
show the other
and it just
things. Yeah.
expands through that, but it's still all connected to
Like a
this
web.
one person. Yes, exactly. And that's the brilliance of Phil Lord, Chris Miller, and Dave Callahan's screenplay, is that it's able to expand and touch all of these strands, but still feel like it's never kind of getting away from the main core of the story either. And just again, like even Gwen in this narrative being caught between two figures that are very similar. Captain Stacy's a guy that is a cop that follows the law to a T, even questioning, his own daughter before being a father. And then you have Miguel, who is so determined to keep the universes that he is now protecting in check, that he doesn't consider the human element, to the idea of the greater good,
Yeah.
sacrificing the one in order to protect everybody, but the one is just as important as everybody. And
Yeah.
so, Gwen kind of being in between those two worlds, and even the betrayal that Miles feels, that because Gwen kind of
Gwen
is
and Peter
on,
B and yeah.
yeah, and all these people sort of becoming members of this group and leaving Miles, out, but also, actively, even if they don't realize it,
Saying
coordinating
yeah.
a plot against Miles. It's
And
that
saying he
the
doesn't belong, right? Like in that
yeah,
whole
and when
thing.
it's
Like,
your
yeah.
friends that are doing it, or being complicit in it, I think it adds even more complexity to the narrative structure than what any comic book movie has done in the past
I agree.
20 years.
And that's what made me, on rewatch, like hearing Gwen's voiceover at the beginning, which is a narration, and is what I didn't realize in the first watch is she's obviously that's her at the end of the movie speaking at the opening of the movie talking about this story, because you even see flashes of the rest of the movie and what she did to fail Miles throughout this thing. And that I love that, and that Miles is that center that the web kind of spreads out from. And I feel like Gwen's story is very much fueled by her friendship and everything with Miles, and that whole arc with her and her father and what happened to Peter and things like that. I think is so interesting, and hearing people view it, I think some interesting conversation online. And I know as two cis men, we don't have a ton to add to this, but I think it is important and interesting that I've heard people talk about it as like a trans allegory, right? Like using the trans flag throughout the film, her colors on Gwen's costume and her hair, and the way that the watercolors, which we talked about, move into kind of the trans flag colors, and Captain Stacy wearing a trans flag on his uniform, a trans kids matter flag in Gwen's bedroom. I don't think the interesting conversation is this Gwen Stacy trans, or is Peter Parker trans, but just using it as just a kind of a way of viewing that type of story. I think is those types of things that you don't see in movies like this, and I think are interesting to go deeper and think about these characters and what they're going through and how that views to real world things and real people and stuff like that. So I don't know if you've read any of that, Eric, or seen
I
people
have,
talk
and
about it,
and I
think
think
it's really,
I think it's diverse in a
yeah,
way that it's not heavy handed and it's not
yeah,
trying to hit you over the head. It's allowing different perspectives to be
yeah,
interpreted without saying you're wrong.
yeah,
And I think that that's also a really important point of this story, is that Miles being an outcast within this spider club and being told he's not good enough, or not, he's not supposed to be a Spider-Man. It really sends home this really powerful feeling of isolation and loneliness that I think the spider character in general feels. And I think a lot of people within marginalized communities can relate to those things, and the movie is opening itself up and saying it's okay to have this conversation and to interpret it the way you want to, and
yeah,
no interpretation is wrong. I think that
yeah,
that's the main thing. It's open to having that, and opening its heart to say these
yeah,
things, like even just seeing Miles wearing the Black Lives
yeah,
Matter
button,
button, like things
yeah,
like that. Like, it's in there, it's not propaganda, it's just saying, hey, this is a part of who this character is, and it's sharing this and these worlds with everybody, and it's doing it in a way where I think there's going to be a generation of kids that will be able to see themselves on the screen, like even seeing the emo black version of a punk,
yeah,
with Hobby, with Daniel Kaluuya's character. Like, that's something that's not rarely seen in the 1970s Sex Pistols punk
yeah,
era of British rock, and that was a part of it. Like, like it's not just simply doing it to be quote unquote woke. It's doing it because that was a part that's never been touched upon, and it's actually bringing it back into the conversation and not erasing it from history. So
yeah,
these things are so important within the context of this narrative, but again, it's looking at something that's even bigger than itself in a way that doesn't feel like it's trying just to be a part of the conversation at the time. It's just
absolutely.
there.
Feels
And
natural, and
yeah.
like and I love that, of like you can go deeper into each one of these characters and see some sort of metaphor, allegory, or very much just who the character is. And that's just kind of what I loved, and I feel like what builds on this movie just being so fantastic. So I do some reading on all of that. There's people who are doing some interesting commentary on whether it's Gwen or Miles, or like you said, Hobie, or everyone, like even having you know um uh I love the new characters. We can move on to that. So you have Jess Drew and Spider Woman, and Pavatir Prabhakar, I think. I'm butchering pronunciations, I'm sorry, but Spider-Man India, awesome. I love Mumbattan when they go there, and like all the humor in the movie I think works. I don't think it's quite as funny as maybe the first movie, because it does have quite a serious tone throughout.
But the
It
chai
is
tea thing is
The
very
chai
funny.
tea is great, and there's great bits like that throughout. Like, I think both of these movies are almost sometimes too clever for their own good, or there's so much thrown at you where you miss it, or you kind of just like, that's really funny, but you don't like laugh out loud. You know what I mean? I
Yeah.
did laugh out loud multiple times, but it's not like a pure comedy. It's just like that. And, you know, I don't want to say this is all Phil Lord and Chris Miller, because I think they are very great writers and very great producers. But they just have a good sense of working with their teams to come up with very clever humor, very clever meta commentary that I think is a through line throughout all their movies. Like Peter Parked Car made me laugh way harder than I thought, and like all the different Spider-Man, the Lego Spider-Man, I think is a great nod to their Lego movies. But just that one line from Oscar Isaac of being like, "Thanks, Peter, you're one of our best," and then like beep boop boop, and like that Spider-Man just like killed me. I just thought I like the team of spider people in the first movie more, just because they were more of a team, and I feel like we got a little bit more of them. And I mean, Nick Cage is Spider-Man Noir. I can't wait for him to interact with Andy Samberg's Ben Reilly. Like, I just think that that'll be amazing. Like, there's got to be a fight between those two in the second movie, right? Like, there has to be. But I just think like everyone did such a great job, and the amount of spider people that they throw in, or spider beings they throw in this movie, is insane. Shout out to Chris Anka, who did all the character, not all of them, but like the majority of the character designs in this movie. I know Chris through Kind of Funny. I've done a couple reviews with Chris over there. We reviewed The Green Knight together and a couple other things over on Kind of Funny. Great guy, a very, very talented comic book artist. And he's been doing on his Twitter feed and stuff and Instagram some breakdowns of how he came up with the costume designs in this film and how he worked with the team. So go check out Chris's stuff. He's fantastic, and all the designs of the spider people. Like, if you have a favorite version of Spider-Man or a spider person or spider being, they're probably in this movie somewhere. Like, if you're a fan of the video games, the PS4 Insomniac version of Spider-Man is there. You have, oh my god, the uh, live action Prowler from the MCU universe is there, which is absolutely wild. You have Donald Glover pop in, which is such a meta thing in itself. And I'm waiting to see if Eric comes back, because he did drop out because of his internet, I think, and he might have to reload, but I'm just going to keep talking. So, like the amount of people, I'm going to stop now and we'll go back, or we'll wait and see if Eric comes back. He's going to try to jump back in. God, I didn't miss this, everyone. The technical issues from certain internets and different things is always wild, but I'm going to stop here and then see.
I'm in the driver's seat, Spider-Man! Smite in his battle chip! Remember, always wear your seatbelt. Too much for you? Spider-Man's no match for my Spider Slayer! No thanks, I already showered today. I'll bet the guys really flip over you. Excuse me while I get myself out of a pinch.
Web-shooting Spider-Man figures and vehicles sold separately.
And we are back. I'm not sure. Eric got sucked into the Spider-Verse.
Spider bite incepted this transmission. So
yeah. What universe did you get sucked into?
I got sucked into the world of Venom, actually, which was not a fun place to be, I have to admit.
Which we did visit in this movie. We were talking about all the different spider people and spider. I think that's what we were talking about before you left us. I think no matter who you're a fan of in the comics or the TV shows or the video games or something like that, that spider person or spider being is probably in this movie somewhere. It's not every single spider being, but oh my god, there's so many characters in this. Like, you know, I've watched, you know, the new Rockstar's breakdown of Easter eggs and things in this movie, and I don't even think they can point them all out, because there's so many. Like, I think this will be one of those movies where you could go frame by frame when it's out on, you know, streaming or 4K, that you could pick out different characters, some original, some from the comics, and different things like that. Like, did you have a favorite spider being in this movie, Eric? Because like, I just loved seeing even as a video game fan, like the newer Insomniac Spider-Man, when there's a video game joke, seeing some of the live action stuff was jarring, and felt it shouldn't work, but it weirdly did. Like when you see Donald Glover pop up as the Prowler, like the MCU version of the Prowler, like um is awesome. And because I don't know if he'll ever play that character in live action in an actual, you'd hope they introduce Miles Morales into the MCU. But it's such a kind of fun nod of even like the meta thing there of him originally wearing a Spider-Man costume in Community, and then people wanting him to play Miles Morales, and then him playing Uncle Aaron in the MCU, and now finally, playing the Prowler in this. Like I think is
and
really,
meeting
really
a
cool.
version of Miles
Yeah.
Morales in
Yeah.
this Spider-Verse. I think stuff like that is a lot of fun. I don't know if he was there and I missed him, but the one Spider-Man that I would like to see, or if maybe he was and I need to rewatch it, was the Spider-Man from the 90s cartoon. That's the one that
I don't think he was. And I thought maybe the Ben Reilly, like Andy Samberg's Ben Reilly, was going to be the Ben Reilly from the animated series, but he seems like he was more like the comic book Ben Reilly than the animated series. And we did get Spectacular Spider-Man, like Josh Keaton actually has a line of dialogue in this, which I thought was really, really cool. And you get the 60s Spider-Man animated coming back and with one bit. But yeah, we don't see the 90s, because I just want that theme in there somewhere, Eric.
Yeah.
Like you got to have that.
Well, the Aerosmith theme, right? Like
yeah.
it's pretty good. But the sad thing about the 60s Spider-Man thing is that Paul Soule actually passed away a few years ago. So unfortunately they weren't able to get his voice for and he's from Toronto. So shame there. But yeah, it's just interesting seeing all these different versions kind of interact. And like you were saying with like even the Lego Spider-Man, I think that is probably the funniest moment of the film, and the bit I laughed at the most, specifically with the communicator sound effect. I think like that's where like that Lord and Miller humor does tend to creep in a little bit, even in the trailer when we see that one therapist sequence and all the Spider-Men come like flooding in that sound effect of the like it's just like those little things feel like the inner child of Lord and Miller are coming out in those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. I already mentioned Peter Parked Car, which I laughed at quite a bit. Taron Killam plays Web Slinger, which I think it was kind of fun.
Even he sounds a little bit like Nick Cage. I'd say like Andy Samberg and Taron Killam almost sound like they're doing variations of the Nick Cage impression almost.
Yeah, I totally agree there. We've Andy Samberg, not enough of him in this, but he's doing the Nick Cage thing for Scarlet Spider Ben Reilly. You mentioned Spider Bite, which is Amanda Stenberg. There's just so many people. Yorma Tacone played Adriano Tumis, or the Vulture.
The Renaissance Vulture, which is amazing. Like the Leonardo da Vinci type, and like that fight sequence is just so incredibly well choreographed. You know where all the action is going, the dynamic of the different fighting styles that each Spider person is bringing to the table in that sequence, and just the idea of this Vulture, like his own backstory of being pulled into this world. It's like, oh, you were probably just sitting and doing blah blah blah, and then you were it's like, yeah, that's about it. And like just seeing him sit at a cafe is very funny.
Yes, all the art jokes in that opening because of Da Vinci and that they're at the Guggenheim. Nevis laughed a lot. My wife, who's in the art world, kind of laughed quite a bit during that opening sequence. God, there's so many more too. I'm trying to look through and see. Hearing Yuri Lowenthal as the Insomniac Spider-Man, I thought was really, really cool. Being a video game fan, I think those are fantastic games. So not enough Peter B. Parker for me in this. Like I thought. I liked Mayday and that he got back with his version of Mary Jane. They reconciled and had a kid. Like I think that was great character growth from that version of Spider-Man. But he was one of my favorite things in that first film, and his intro just still destroys me every time they go, okay, let's do this one last time. And he talks about his really sad history. I think
crying in the shower is very funny.
Like is so funny. Like just every little beat from that is so good, and he's utilized okay in this movie, but you can tell like everyone who was on that spider team in that first movie is kind of relegated to probably playing a bigger part in part 3, where this was very much Gwen and Miles in this one. And then you had, you know, like I mentioned, Spider-Man India and Jess Drew and 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 a couple other people that have a little bit more of a focus. But
Yeah, Miguel O'Hara, like, who was introduced at the very end in the post credit scene of Into the Spider-Verse, and Greta Lee as his sort of his
yeah,
tech,
Lila,
yeah, like his Alexa or something
AI,
like
yeah.
that. Yeah, so like that I think is also like an important aspect of the story, and I really do think, like, you know, in terms of supporting performances so far we've seen this year, Oscar Isaac's work, I think, is on par with some of the best. Like, it is a really fascinating character, and just kind of it shouldn't work because of how ridiculous it is, not just like the futuristic aspect of the character, but the vampiric nature of him. It's like,
Yeah.
on paper, it's like that shouldn't be, you know,
Great Morbius
emotionally
joke.
wrought in any way whatsoever, but then you begin to understand his motivations, and we've talked about this before too, where the best villains are ones that you can understand their point of view or why they're doing what they're doing, you know, not simply just because they want to take over the world, or, you know, have all the money or something like that, like something that's
The
just,
ones that believe they're doing something good, right?
yes.
Like, I think, and they really believe it, and you can kind of see their perspective, even if what they're doing is kind of objectively wrong in certain,
Yeah, and it's
you know,
still
cases.
oppressing other people in the process, but they are justifying it by a means to an end, or, you know, again, the greater good aspect, like something like Spock would talk about in Star Trek, where it's like, you know, it's the one versus the many, and, you know, as soon as you lose sight of the one, well, you might as well just be sacrificing the many, because the one does become the many.
Yeah. I love J.K. Simmons coming back, and I love that he's the one
He's the
constant.
universal
Yeah, like he's the
J.
what do they
Jonah.
call it? Yeah, like he Nexus being, he's like the same in every universe. It's J.K. Simmons. So like he just either has more hair or less hair or something like that. So I thought that was fantastic that they just was like, nope, no one else can play J. Jonah Jameson. It has to be J.K.
I
Simmons.
think that's the best thing to do, though, with that. Like, you can't not have J.K. Simmons. It would be
Yeah,
wrong if it was somebody else. The
absolutely.
only other
Yeah.
person that could do it, I think, is Ed Asner, because Ed Asner voiced J. Jonah Jameson in the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, but
Yeah.
sadly he's passed away, so.
Yeah. Um so I love all that. I think another criticism, if you're kind of overthinking um the plot of the movie and some of the stuff that happens, is for a lot of these spider beings, we know those versions of the characters, whether it be, you know, Spectacular Spider-Man from the animated series, the Insomniac Spider-Man from the PlayStation 4 series, some of the other ones from the different universes that people have actually followed. um I think a fair criticism is, would these spider beings act this way? Like, how were they convinced by Miguel to go against one of their own and kind of and say like, oh yeah, Miles isn't supposed to be Spider-Man and we need to let his father die. And there's more nitpicking I have there with some of the stuff too, of like, if he was never meant to be Spider-Man, why does he have canon events and things like that too? Like, I guess it's because he became Spider-Man, he then has to like inherit those canon events. And so I both love and don't love some of that stuff, where like, yeah, you could make the argument of like, the Spectacular Spider-Man we know from the animated series, or the Insomniac Spider-Man, those are the two I'm referencing because I know those, um, wouldn't act that way. Like, there's no way that they would go against Miles, right? Like, that's against the fiber of their being from what we know of those characters. So I think there's a little suspension of disbelief there. So I don't know if you felt that way a little bit, Eric, of like, how would these spider people, like, why they're almost joining this, you know, again, even us as viewers can see where Miguel is coming from. And I guess if some spider people view it from this bigger thing of going, well, a universe could collapse if these things don't stop. So I guess that overcomes or overtakes like saving one person, but it is the one versus everyone kind of thing that we've seen recently in Last of Us and other things like that too.
There is a hive mind mentality to it that kind of feels like, again, like it's almost like bees, where they're protecting the queen and they'll do whatever they have to do this one thing, and it's like a singular mindset. I don't disagree with you, where like it does feel like, the spider people in general are always portrayed as very smart, sort of outside the box, independent thinkers, and to think for themselves and to always do the right thing. So you could look at it again, though, as a dictatorship, as propaganda, as Miguel is somebody that has been feeding everybody else this one way of thinking and this information that we haven't seen the other side. So he's saying that this person doesn't belong and is a threat to the many universes, including your own. So we need to protect that. So I think you could look at it that way. But then also I do think that there is an argument to be made about what you're saying. But there is a kind of contradiction or fighting back against that a little bit, I think, with Spider-Punk, where Spider-Punk can see the writing on the wall, and he can see that like this is this is against what he is, as not only as a spider person, but as an anti-conformist, and like by the end of this narrative, he's like, peace out, I'm done with this, because this is like not what I signed up for.
And then ultimately you get that group at the end that joins, Gwen Stacy. And I realized in a rewatch that what she's saying at the beginning is what she's saying to all these different spider people to convince them to join her to help Miles. Like that's what it is, right? Like, so I think that bookend is really really clever. Shout out to Spider Canada as well, that you saw a couple times with the hockey stick, and which is great. I found an image. Maybe I'll use this image for the art that we have, because I think that could be fun. But they have a hockey stick, and it's they. If you know the 1972 Summit Series jerseys when Canada played the USSR, that's what the costume's kind of based on, and it looks really, really cool. So I want to give a shout out to Spider Canada as well. But going back to those kind of canon events, and kind of that I loved and hated some of that stuff of how these spider people were acting, the part that I did love, which we've already compared earlier in this very detailed discussion we're having about this movie, I did love that kind of meta breakdown of what Spider-Man has always been and what it always should be in the eyes of the Spider-Verse in this universe, and all these separate universes. Like, they always need a mentor or family member to die, and that's their Uncle Ben moment, right? Like, and we see all these different Uncle Ben moments, whether it's Uncle Aaron or Uncle Ben or Peter
or Captain Stacy.
Captain Stacy's almost a separate one on top of the other one, right? Like, you always have the mentor family member moment, where in the MCU we always thought it was Tony, but then it was really Aunt May, but you could argue that it was either of those
or both.
Or both, right? And then you always have the police captain who always dies as well, whether that's Captain Stacy or another police captain. The captain always dies, and then usually Gwen Stacy always dies, right? Or in Gwen Stacy's version, Peter
the traditional romantic lead.
Yeah, yes, that's a good point too. So whoever the romantic lead is, that's not Mary Jane, usually dies. So like those canon events that I think is such an interesting way of tackling the story, both from that meta layer that we talked about of like, Miles just not belonging because his story is a little different. But I think is like analyzing both the superhero genre and the Spider-Man genre, which is a genre of itself, right? Whether it's comics, movies, video games, and we see live action, we see animated, we see Venom, we see every element that always is part of every Spider-Man story.
Venom's its own medium.
Well, it is. It's its own little web, right?
Yeah.
Because like Venom always happens in Spider-Man's universe. It's like one of those canon events. Is a symbiote attaches itself to someone, and that event always happens. So I think like looking at the Spider-Man story, and we talked about No Way Home being this celebration of Spider-Man, which I think is still true, and I think it's still a great movie.
But this eats it for
But
lunch, you know.
yeah, I agree. That's what I'm getting to, is
Yeah.
that like this really looks at the Spider-Man story and tries to deconstruct it and go, why does every Spider-Man story have to be the same, right? Like, why does it always have to have these things? Why can't it do its own thing? Why can't it tell its own story? Why does it have to be? Why do superhero things have to be so repetitive and
Follow the
cyclical and
formula.
like formula, like where why can't we do something different? And I think what both of these movies has shown is exactly that. We want to do something different. We want to tell a different story, while still having all the trademarks and paying homage and paying, you know, tribute to these other stories and universes that we've loved with great, like I love the Raimi movies. I like elements of the Amazing movies. Like I like, you know, I love the MCU, right? And it references all of that kind of stuff. And I love the comics. Spider-Man comics were the comics that I read as a kid. Like I still have some of my Spider-Man comics. I have my favorite comic book cover as a kid was Spider-Man with the Iron Spider suit that was metallic and silver, and then it was like holographic, and like I think it was a Todd McFarlane cover, and like I still have that somewhere around here, and it was one of my favorite versions of Spider-Man as a kid, and like it's the one comic book I read throughout my whole life, and on and off, and to kind of pay history and kind of deconstruct that, I think is really kind of interesting. And so I again, I love the use of all the spider people. Don't love all of it, but I like that kind of looking at the canon of Spider-Man and that this always has to happen, and goes, why does that always have to happen? Like, and I think that's cool, and we'll explore that even more of like in the follow-up of like, do those things actually have to happen, or are you kind of causing them, maybe? But I think that will be an interesting thing. Anything else you want to, I mean, we didn't talk about the ending, I guess, is that, unless you want to talk about any
Yeah, I
spider
just wanted
people,
to add, add on to, so the
the
canonical
canon events.
exposition I think is really important because it doesn't feel like you're just being spoon-fed exposition for the sake of it, in terms of getting the overarching storyline of Miguel O'Hara, or him explaining what the world is like. It's actually deconstructing the world building in general. And we've been hearing a lot about this because of movies like Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, and even Shazam, Fury of the Gods, not doing that well at the box office, and superhero fatigue. And I think that's true because the market's been so saturated with the genre that people are getting tired of it. But I think the reason why people are getting tired of it now, because it's been going on since, really predominantly since 2008 nonstop, is that we're being given the same story again and again and
Yeah.
again and again. And it's always an origin story, even if it's a different character. It's
Well,
always
that's one version is an origin story.
yeah, but that's usually always the first film. And then the
Yes,
second
yeah.
movie is more of the same, just more of it.
A world-ending event that
Yeah.
they need to stop.
And then sometimes the third one gets a little weirder if, there's less control over it, or if, Marvel, for example, has moved on to another character that they need to bring in and do an origin story for them.
So they let people go wild with
but there's still kind of like
a formula.
Yeah, a control over these things. And it kind of feels like none of these movies are truly able to let loose in a way that explores the medium in which they came from in a kind of fun and exciting way, but also, to kind of wake up from what we have been given time and time again, and to renew our interest in the genre. And I think with these two Spider-Verse movies, you're seeing that formula be questioned in a way that is breaking down the system in which it's been created or upheld. It's like it's worked for so long, but you can't do the same thing all the time because you're just going to become numb to it. And again, we'll talk about it more when we review The Flash, but I think the lessons that Spider-Verse is teaching are the ones that filmmakers need to learn and listen to, but also studio execs, and not just look at it from a point of view of like, how can we you know, like, because I mean, even with Spider-Verse, there is this as well, and I think because you mentioned like with the video games, comic books, the movies, and things like that, there is a corporate element to it all where it's like it's selling you certain things, but it's less so with Spider-Verse than I would say the Flash, where when I was watching the Flash, I felt like I was watching Space Jam: A New Legacy all over again, but to the point of it was specifically selling me on all of DC that
Yeah.
Warner Brothers has adapted. It's like, oh, do you love these? Do you love this? Do you love this? Well, buy this or go back and rewatch this or buy the new 4K that we just released. Where Spider-Verse, there is some of that, but there's still a purpose to all of it. And it's that same way that I felt with the Lego movie. You know, you're taking something that is essentially product, but you're finding a way in and making it more referential and irreferential to a degree and having fun with it, and also kind of finding something that is less disposable and more tangible for the viewer to take away and think about. And I think that those are the elements in Spider-Verse and in the Lego movie that really work to selling it as more than just a commercial.
Yeah, I agree. So the moral of the story: hire Phil Lord and Chris Miller to produce.
Yeah,
your
you
movie.
should. Lawrence Kasdan and Kathleen Kennedy should have let them made their solo movie. You know,
I will never. I'll never forgive them for that. I just want to know what that would have been like. You know, that's all I want. I just want to know one day. I hope when, I don't know, someone else is in control of Lucasfilm and there's some sort of
100 years from now.
documentary. I'm on my deathbed and someone's like, the documentary about Solo's coming out. You can finally see some of the footage from how Phil Lord and Chris Miller intended it. But yeah, I mean, they're fantastic, and they always find that angle of whoever they're working with, whether they're directing something or helping produce something or writing something, of finding that angle that make something a little bit more out of, you know, some sort of property or IP, if you want to look at it like in the most kind of corporate of terms. So yeah, I think we didn't talk about like the action in the movie is great. That one chase sequence with all the spider people going against Miles is incredible. We've already talked about the animation, so let's just wrap it up by talking about the cliffhanger and the ending, and then we'll wrap this up. So the end of the movie, we get this sequence where Miles gets sent back to his universe, which, if you're paying attention, is clearly Earth 42, which is not Miles's universe.
Which is based on the DNA of the spider which bit him. Yeah. That's how the machine reads it.
Yes. So he gets sent to Earth 42, which we don't know. They do that classic kind of movie thing where they're intercutting, you know, two different sequences to make it seem like they're at the same spot.
Because Gwen's in his world.
Yeah. And so I think it's very, very well done. Even if you, again, if you know it's part one, you know what it's building up to. I think the reveal, you know, you clearly, again, if you are listening, you can kind of know where it's going. But the reveal of Miles' Uncle Aaron being alive, and that he's in a different universe where a version of himself never was bitten by that spider that was intended to bite him. So I think that's an interesting point too, that the spider was always meant to bite a Miles Morales, which is, I guess, why it finds him in his universe, which I think is interesting, right? It's still a canon event, is that a Miles Morales needs to be bitten by that spider. But it's because you even see it briefly when the Spot's talking, the Miles with his braids in the school, right as the spider gets sucked out.
Oh, that's another quick thing. The retconning in this is so much better and still ridiculous in how humorous it is compared to the Fast and Furious movies
and stuff like that. Yeah, with the Spot always being, and the references to Everything Everywhere All at Once. I think are
the
fun,
bagel,
like the bagel, and there's a billboard for a version of that movie that's called something else. But anyways, going back to the ending, so then it's revealed that this version of Miles has become the Prowler, and is working with Uncle Aaron. And is very menacing. That one punch that Uncle Aaron does, I thought he smashed Miles' face. Just his head exploded. But it's very, very well done. It is an excellent cliffhanger, which I know I already talked shit about how I don't like half movies. Like, it is a good cliffhanger, I will give it that. Like, it does make you very excited for the next movie. Then they cut to Gwen, who has put together this team of spider beings to come help Miles against Miguel and what seemingly looks like his alternate version of himself. But I think there's some good theories out there that that version of Miles might not actually be a bad guy. He might be like a hero version of the Prowler,
Or an
who just
anti-hero.
or anti-hero is a better description. But
Uncle Aaron and anti-hero Prowler.
which I could definitely see, right? Like
Yeah.
Miles is meant to be heroic in every universe, so I think that might be a we want you to think that this guy's a bad guy, but really it's just he never got superpowers, so he had to find a way to do good, and he ultimately changed the fate of his uncle, and obviously his father is dead in that universe, and that kind of maybe pushes him to do that. But I think he probably will be a more violent sort of anti-hero rather than a pure villain, because I still think Miguel will be the villain in the spot. Obviously, even Miguel will probably turn and see the light in the last movie if it. But who knows? This movie always kind of plays with your expectations. So I do like the ending, even though that's kind of contradicting what I said earlier. But it's just I'm like, man, I wish I had the rest right now, which I guess is both a good and a bad thing. So I popped for Spider-Man Noir, which means Nick Cage is probably coming back for the next movie. I like that they have the team from the first movie as well as some people from this movie. So I think you had everyone from the first movie. So you had a Spider-Ham, Spider-Man Noir, Peter B. Parker, Penny Parker, and Gwen, right? That's
Yeah.
everyone from the first one. And then you also
There's also
had
reference to
Spider-Punk.
Aunt May as well within Miles Morales, like the dead Peter Parker, because she moves away at the beginning of
Yes.
Across the Spider-Verse.
Yeah, she moves. I forget where they said she moved to, Florida or something like
Yeah.
that. And then you have the new group also including Spider-Punk, right?
Yeah.
You have Spider-Bite, I believe, as well was there because she kind of helps him escape at the end too. And those are like kind of the new additions to the group. Spider-Man India. And then you also have the villain group, which is Miguel. I mean villain in quotes because like I don't necessarily think that Jess Drew is like a villain, but she is still kind of on Miguel's side of things, as well as Andy Samberg's Ben Reilly. So
I'm sure he'll also recruit probably some more people that maybe are more
Yeah.
prominent and beyond the Spider-Verse. It would be
Yeah.
amazing if Jared Leto's Morbius was in there, and at the end of Beyond Spider-Verse, they're just like, we need to kill Morbius.
yeah. I would love that. So I do think it's an effective ending. Yeah, I do agree with the theory that the Prowler that we see is meant to look like a villain, but
It's misleading. It's a misdirect.
Yeah. Do you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, I'm sure there are going to be aspects of that character that's maybe like Miguel O'Hara, where like he's somebody that kind of does his best, but at the same time isn't maybe as morally thoughtful compared to Miles or other versions of Peter Parker or Spider Beings, where the whole point of Spider-Man is that he's somebody that even in the darkest hour he's altruistic. He has to put his own needs and interests aside, or their own interests and needs aside, in order to help those and be selfless. And so, like that's always been something that's weirdly been inspiring, I think, for that character, for a lot of kids feeling like alone and like they're not able to relate to anybody. And like when you read that as a kid, whether it be a comic book or watch the animated show, you always got that sense from the character. And even in the movies where it's like I can't, like I have to sacrifice the things that I want, not because I have to continue to be miserable for the sake of it, but it's to help everybody else because I need to make sure that I use these powers responsibly. And it goes back to the Uncle Ben saying. So it's, like that's the story in its nutshell. And again, it's diverging from that as well, which is a really good thing because it's keeping it fresh and exciting for fans that have known this character for so long, that can be surprised by these new iterations of the spider beings and the storytelling and the music and even the closing credits Bond-esque style animated sequence is so beautifully done. The soundtrack is incredible. Everything in
Oh
this
God, I've been
movie,
listening to that soundtrack over and over and over
it
again.
it's such a complete piece of filmmaking, even if it's only half of a whole. It's still, out of all of these part ones that we've been getting in film and television and even comic books with volumes and things like that, it does feel the most complete, because to your point, there's the part of it where you could look at it as the cliffhanger with Miles'
Mhm.
storyline, but you can also look at it as the climax and the conclusion or the completion of Gwen Stacy's story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great. 5 out of 5 for me. Again, not a perfect movie, but as close. I think I agree with what you said earlier, Eric, that I think the first Spider-Verse movie, Into the Spider-Verse, might be, I think is one of my favorite movies of all time. And that's might be hyperbolic, but it's true. And I think is the best superhero movie of all time. And I think this is a close second. And I think once I view part one and part two together, I think not only could this be the best superhero trilogy ever, I think that part one and part two could easily surpass that first movie, which is such a crazy thing for me to think of. But I think my only thing is that it does feel like sort of half a movie, but that half a movie is better than most other movies. So, like most other superhero movies for sure.
Yeah.
And blockbusters and things like that. Like, I think it's harder to compare it to movies are hard to compare because they're sometimes doing completely different
But I
things. And we
rather
don't,
take this half
yeah,
than wholes of most Marvel and DC live action movies that we have gotten,
yeah,
even the good ones. I think that this half is 10 times better than a lot of those live action movies. And like, again, like you look at someone like Oscar Isaac, I think there's more complexity and interest as an anti-hero here than there is as Moonlight, or Moon Knight,
Moon
pardon me.
Knight. Yeah, I agree.
Moonlight.
I
But
mean,
but that goes
that's
also
clear
to
as
show you
day. Yeah.
that's that character. It's like it's wasting the talents of somebody who is an incredible actor, but you kind of can put them in the blockbuster world, and then their talents can diminish or dilute over time. And so when you get something like this that meets their level of expertise and their dedication to the craft, it makes it all the more worthwhile. And so, like, seeing that character again, it's just like there's just so much going on with that, and he's only just one piece of the tapestry. And
Yeah.
there's so many great little moments for everybody in this movie that feels like they're getting more than just coming in for a couple of days to do voiceovers. Like, it feels like they're getting a full experience for themselves, creatively speaking.
Cool. Your rating?
4.5 out of 5. I will probably give it a 5 once I've seen part 2, but like, I
Yeah.
do really love the movie. I think it's the film to beat of the summer, and I think every movie going forward will be comparing it to both of these films, and
Yeah.
it's going to be hard not to.
Anything you'd like to see in the next one? A Spider-Person? I think we both want to see the '90s Spider-Man.
Yes, and
probably, right?
that theme song,
Yeah.
oh, that guitar lick would be sweet.
The other prediction or something we might see. I know we were supposed to see Spider-Man Japan, which I don't think we did see in this movie, but I thought that was announced. So maybe we see him in the next one. Superior Spider-Man could be an interesting one to be on Miguel's side, which is when Doc Ock possessed Peter Parker, like they switched bodies, and then
Right.
Doc Ock becomes Spider-Man for like a couple years, and he's called the Superior Spider-Man. I think that could be interesting to have him on Miguel's side. But it should be interesting to see kind of where they take and what other spider people or spider beings they incorporate in the next movie. Because you think like they were thinking about doing that Silk spin-off, right? They have the Madam Web movie coming up, which you'd think ties into this because Madam Web's like a big
Is a
part of,
multiverse jumper, and yeah.
yeah. Like, I know they said, like, Phil Lord and Chris Miller have come out and said that Miles's story is this trilogy and that there's not going to be more after that. Okay. I
Well,
think
I think
Sony will have
I think Sony can continue it, but I think Lord and Miller
Yeah.
and this team are looking at it from the perspective of like, this is our story. We're coming in and telling it how we want to. You can do what you want afterwards, but this is us. This is what represents what we made. You
But I
know.
think Sony has been trying so hard to get their own Spider-Man universe, right? And they're finally have sort of gotten it where they're tying everything together with these Spider-Verse animated movies.
Well, it's about holding on to the rights, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the big thing about the Sony verse, is that it's about keeping the rights from falling back into Marvel's hands, because they have to continually negotiate between the two studios in order to come to an agreement that you can use the character that you originally licensed us, but we are going to continue to profit off of this character as well. So it's basically like divorced parents sharing custody of a child, you know. But now it is kind of, it's almost like the Spider-Verse, like I could see Ken Feige being like, yeah, these movies are great, but they've kind of fucked us over a little bit, because now they've given them more ground to build on their version of it.
I have one more question before we go. Theorizing about things. I'm still a big MCU person. I like that they've tackled the multiverse. Maybe it's not done as well as it is here. But in Secret Wars, if that's still how they're gonna go, I know that there's talk about how they might pivot away from Kang and multiverse stuff and try something else. But I still think ultimately we might get Secret Wars, and I still think the multiverse will play a part of it. Could you see a animated Miles Morales showing up, or do you think the MCU would take a different approach, not mixing animated and live action? Of if Miles was to be, would it be their own version of Miles, or would this Miles show up in Secret Wars? Because the rumor about Secret Wars is that it will be that universe. It'll be Endgame, like the Portal moment, except you're gonna have characters from all these different universes, good and bad, that we've liked and disliked coming together. I'd be curious to see if they'd go as, like, you have had animated characters work with live action in Loki, and we liked Miss Minutes and things like that, but would an animated Miles coming out and helping fight in Secret Wars be strange?
I think it just depends really on the filmmaker. I think
I
it
guess,
depends on who the
because that
director
rumor
is.
that Rami might do it, right?
Yeah,
Rami
because if
might
they're
do it.
comfortable enough with the animation style, then maybe they will take it on. But if they don't have that background, then I could see what will happen. I can already envision it where it's like a scene of the character leaving their animated world, and then like a physical manifestation of themselves is created in a live action version. But then it would defeat the purpose of what Lord and Miller and this team have created over the
and have set up, saying that live action universes are live action, animated's animated. And I know that's like the not what you're necessarily talking about. I just mean from a look perspective, that each universe has its own look. Some is live action, some is animated, different animation styles and things like that. Like, yeah, I don't know. Like, I could see there being a live action segment, but more Roger Rabbit style in the second or the next Spider-Verse and the Beyond one, because Tom Holland is the only live action Spider-Man we did not see in this movie.
No,
right?
even though he is referenced at one point with
Yeah.
Doctor Strange.
Yeah, so it does connect to the MCU, even if it's tangentially, right? Because the MCU,
well, even Venom, right?
It connected with Venom, which also connected with the MCU, and the two Spider-Man movies, which connected with the MCU. So you got to think that they want Tom Holland involved in that next movie, and that's why I thought it was an interesting choice to make the live action characters actually live action. I thought they would animate them, like they would change their look for the movie.
Yeah.
But they didn't. So maybe we're rotoscoping or something like that. But it seems
Richard
like
Linklater style.
Yeah, but it seems like they're committing to those being live action.
But I like that though.
So do I.
I like the idea that like just because, like even with the Lego stuff, like just because it's the live action universe doesn't necessarily mean that every universe is live action. You know, I mean, there could be one universe that is just like sound, you know, and like visually you can't interpret it. So like, why not play with the mediums and have something that again elevates the material to a new dimension and creates something dynamic in its direction. And
It's called Beyond the Spider-Verse. I
Yeah.
wouldn't, and they said they talked about live action sequences in this movie, but they never did it. But I would not be surprised if we get, even if it's short, like a Tom Holland live action segment in the next one. Like I really do think that we probably will get that, and it'll be. I have faith in them that they'll make it work.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it for this one. It was a beefy one, but obviously Eric and I really love talking about this movie. So appreciate it. You guys listening or watching now a week after its release. I hope you've seen the movie a couple times at this point, and it's set to come out on streaming, I think, in a month, basically in mid-July. So we'll be able to watch it much more. I have heard as well that they have fixed those audio issues. I haven't personally gone out to go see how that sounds, but I'm tempted. I am tempted, but I don't usually see a movie 3 times in theaters. It's very rare.
It's no
Unless
John
it's
Wick, chapter 4
for Eric, for a guy who never really cared about the John Wick movies. But I might
watch
go
your
see
dirty
it again.
mouth.
We'll see. But there's a lot of other stuff I got to catch up on, and a lot more stuff we'll be reviewing and watching in the near future. So keep an eye out on Untitled Movie Reviews, which is the channel you're on right now, or if you're on YouTube. We'll have reviews for Elemental, Asteroid City, which you guys can check out very soon. We want to have a main episode out for you guys probably as you're listening to this. I hope that it's out, and I'll be talking about kind of what's been going on the last couple months and things like that. But thank you for everyone for your support and listening or watching. We really do appreciate it. As always, my name is Matt Rohrbeck. You can find more of my work on Family Feud Canada and around the internet. But mostly at untitledmoviepodcast.com. And you can follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rohrbeck.
And I'm Spider March, and you can find more of my video reviews on rogerstv.com/cinemascene and on all the social medias at EM6211.
Until next time.
You. Pew, pew, pew.
Thwip.